Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to our second chapter in MooseChangerPat's Reading Corner. That's me, in case you're wondering. We are reading Pawn of Prophecy by David Eddings, and, as you should always do, you should probably buy the book and read it for yourself if you ever get the chance. Chapter 2. Not long after, in the endless noon of Garion's boyhood, the storyteller appeared once again at the gate of Falder's farm. The storyteller, who seemed not to have a proper name, as other men did, was a thoroughly disreputable old man. The knees of his hose were patched, and the mismatched shoes were out at the toes. His long-sleeved woolen tunic was belted about the waist with a piece of rope, and his hood, a curious garment not normally worn in that part of Sandaria, and one which Garion thought quite fine, with its loosely fitting yoke covering shoulders, back, and chest, was spotted and soiled with spilled food and drink. Only his full cloak seemed relatively new. The old storyteller's white hair was cropped quite close, as was his beard. His face was strong, with a kind of angularity to it, and his features provided no clue to his background. He did not resemble Erend nor Cherik, Algar nor Drasnian, Riven nor Talnedrin, but seemed rather to derive from some racial stock long since forgotten. His eyes were a deep and merry blue, forever young and forever full of mischief. The storyteller appeared from time to time at Falder's farm and was always welcome. He was in truth a ruthless vagabond who made his way in the world by telling stories. His stories were not always new, but there was in his telling of them a special kind of magic. His voice could roll like thunder or hush down into a zephyr-like whisper. He could imitate the voices of a dozen men at once, whistle so like a bird that the birds themselves would come to him to hear what he had to say. And when he imitated the howl of a wolf, the sound could raise the hair on the back of the listeners' necks and strike a chill into their hearts like the depths of a Drasnian winter. He could make the sound of rain and of wind and even, most miraculously, the sound of snow falling. His stories were filled with sounds that made them come alive, and though the sounds and the words with which he wove the tales, sight and smell, and the very feel of strange times and places seemed also to come to life for his spellbound listeners. All of this wonder he gave freely, in exchange for a few meals, a few tankards of ale, and a warm spot in the hay barn in which to sleep. He roamed about the world, seemingly as free of possessions as the birds. Between the storyteller and Aunt Paul, there seemed to be a sort of hidden recognition. She always viewed his coming with a kind of wry acceptance, knowing, it seemed, that the ultimate treasures of her kitchen were not safe so long as he lurked in the vicinity. Loaves and cakes had a way of disappearing when he was around, and his quick knife, always ready, could easily divest the most carefully prepared goose of a pair of drumsticks and a generous slab of breast meat, with 3 swift slices when her back was turned. She called him Old Wolf, and his appearance at the gate of Falder's farm marked the resumption of a contest which had obviously been going on for years. He flattered her outrageously, even as he stole from her. Offered cookies or dark brown bread, he would politely refuse and then steal half a plateful before the platter had moved out of his reach. Her beer pantry and wine cellar might as well have been delivered into his hands immediately upon the appearance at the gate. He seemed to delight in his pilferage, and if she watched him with steely eye, he found quite easily a dozen confederates willing to sack her kitchen in exchange for a single story. Lamentably, among his most able pupils was the boy Garion, often driven to distraction by the necessity of watching at once an old thief and a fledgling one. Aunt Paul would arm herself with a broom and drive them both from her kitchen with hard words and resounding blows, and the old storyteller, laughing, would flee with the boy to some secluded place where they would feast on the fruits of their pilferage, and the old man, tasting frequently from a flagon of stolen wine or beer, would regale his student with stories out of the dim past. The best stories, of course, were saved for the dining hall, when after the evening meal was over and the plates had been pushed back, the old man would rise from his place and carry his listeners off into a world of magical enchantment. "Tell us of the beginnings, my old friend," Falder, always pious, said one evening, "and of the gods." "Of the beginnings and the gods," the old man mused. "A worthy subject, Falder, but a dry and dusty one." "I've noticed that you find all subjects dry and dusty, old wolf," Aunt Paul said, going to the barrel and drawing off a tankard of foamy beer for him. He accepted the tankard with a stately bow. "It's one of the hazards of my profession, Mistress Paul," he explained. He drank deeply, then set the tankard aside. He lowered his head in thought for a moment, then looked directly, or so it seemed, at Garyon. And then he did a strange thing which he had never before done when telling stories in Falder's dining hall. He drew his cloak about him and rose to his full height. "Behold," he said, his voice rich and sonorous, "at the beginning of days made the gods and the worlds, and the seas and the dry land also, and cast they the stars across the night sky, and did set the sun and his wife the moon in the heavens to give light unto the world. And the gods caused the earth to bring forth the beasts, and the waters to bud with fish, and skies to flower with birds. And they made men also, and divided men into peoples. Now the gods were 7 in number, and were all equal, and their names were Balar, and Chaldan, and Nedra, and Issa, and Mara, and Alder, and Torak." Garyon knew the story, of course. Everyone in that part of Sandaria was familiar with it, since the story was of Alorn origin, and the lands on 3 sides of Sandaria were Alorn kingdoms. Though the tale was familiar, however, he had never before heard it told in such a way. His mind soared as in his imagination the gods themselves strode the world in those dim, misty days when the world was first made, and a chill came over him at each mention of the forbidden name of Torak. He listened intently as the storyteller described how each god selected a people. For Balar, the Alorns; for Issa, the Nyissans; for Chaldan, the Arans; for Nedra, the Talnedrans; for Mara, the Marags, which are no more; and for Torak, the Angarax. And he heard how the god Alder dwelt apart and considered the stars and his solitude, and how very few men he accepted as pupils and disciples. Garyon glanced at the others who were listening. Their faces were rapt with attention. Dernick's eyes were wide, and old Kralto's hands were clasped on the table in front of him. Falder's face was pale, and tears stood in his eyes. Aunt Paul stood at the rear of the room. Though it was not cold, she too had drawn her mantle about her and stood very straight, her eyes intent. "And it came to pass," the storyteller continued, "that the god Alder caused to be made a jewel in the shape of a globe. And behold, in the jewel was captured the light of certain stars that did glitter in the northern sky, and great was the enchantment upon the jewel which men called the Orb of Alder. For with the orb could Alder see that which had been seen, that which was, and that which was yet to be." Garyon realized he was holding his breath, for he was now completely caught up in the story. He listened in wonder as Torak stole the orb, and the other gods made war on him. Torak used the orb to sunder the earth and let in the sea to drown the land, until the orb struck back against misuse by melting the left side of his face and destroying the left hand and eye. The old man paused and drained his tankard. Aunt Paul, with her mantle still close to her, brought him another, her movements somehow stately and her eyes burning. I've never heard the story told so, Dernick said softly. It's the Book of Alorn. It's only told in the presence of kings, Krauto said just as softly. I knew a man once who had heard it at a king's court at Sendar, and he remembered some of it. I've never heard it all before, though. The story continued, recounting how Belgarath, the sorcerer, led Cherik and the three sons to regain the orb 2,000 years later, and how the western lands were settled and guarded against the hosts of Torak. The gods removed from the world, leaving Riva to safeguard the orb in his fortress on the Isle of the Winds. There he forged a great sword and set the orb in its hilt. While the orb remained there and the line of Riva sat on the throne, Torak could not prevail. Then Belgarath sent his favorite daughter to Riva to be a mother to kings, while his other daughter remained with him and learned his art, for the mark of the sorcerers was upon her. The old storyteller's voice was now very soft as his ancient tale drew to its close, and between them, he said, did Belgarath and his daughter, the sorceress Polgara, set enchantments to keep watch against the coming of Torak. And some men say they shall abide against his coming, even though it be until the very end of days. For it is prophesied that one day shall maimed Torak come against his kingdoms of the west to reclaim the orb which he so dearly purchased, and battle shall be joined between Torak and the fruit of the line of Riva, and in that battle shall be decided the fate of the world. And then the old man fell silent, and his mantle dropped from about his shoulders, signifying that his story was at an end. There was a long silence in the hall, broken only by a few faint sputters from the dying fire, and the endless song of frogs and crickets in the summer night outside. Finally, Falder cleared his throat and arose, his bench scraping loudly on the wooden floor. "You have done us much honor tonight, my old friend," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "This is an event we will remember for all our lives. You have told us a kingly story not usually wasted on ordinary people." The old man grinned then, his blue eyes twinkling. "I haven't consorted with many kings of late, Falder," he laughed. "They all seem too busy to listen to old tales, and a story must be told from time to time if it's not to be lost. Besides, who knows these days where a king might be hiding?" They all laughed at that and began to push back their benches, for it was growing late and time for those who must be up with the first light of the sun to seek their beds. "Will you carry a lantern for me to the place where I sleep, boy?" the storyteller asked Garion. "Gladly," Garion said, jumping up and running into the kitchen. He fetched down a square glass lantern, lighted the candle inside it from one of the blanked kitchen fires, and went back into the dining hall. Falder was speaking with the storyteller as he turned away. Garion saw a strange look pass between the old man and Aunt Paul, who still stood at the back of the hall. "Are we ready then, boy?" the old man asked as Garion came up to him. "Whenever you are," Garion replied, and the two of them turned and left the hall. "Why is the story unfinished?" Garion asked, bursting with curiosity. "Why did you stop before we found out what happened when Torak met the Riven King?" "That's another story," the old man explained. "Will you tell it to me sometime?" Garion pressed. The old man laughed. "Torak and the Riven King have yet to meet," he said, "so I can't very well tell it, can I? At least, not until after their meeting." "It's only a story," Garion objected. "Isn't it?" "Is it?" The old man removed a flagon of wine from under his tunic and took a long drink. "What's to say what's only a story, and what's truth disguised as a story?" "It's only a story," Garion said stubbornly, suddenly feeling very hard-headed and practical like any good Sendar. "It can't really be true. Why, Belgarath the sorcerer would be, I don't know how old, and people don't live that long." 7,000 years, the old man said. "What?" "Belgarath the sorcerer is 7,000 years old, perhaps a bit older." "That's impossible," Garion said. "Is it? How old are you?" 9, next Aristride. "And in 9 years you've learned everything that's both possible and impossible. You're a remarkable boy, Garion." Garion flushed. Well, he said, somehow not quite so sure of himself, the oldest man I ever heard of is old Weldrick over on Mildred's farm. Durdick says he's over 90 and that he's the oldest man in the district. And it's a very big district, of course, the old man said solemnly. How old are you? Garion asked, not wanting to give up. Old enough, boy, the old man said. It's still only a story, Garion insisted. Many good and solid men would say so, the old man told him, looking up at the stars. Good men who live out their lives believing only in that which they can see and touch. But there's a world beyond what we can see and touch, and that world lives by its own laws. What may be impossible in this very ordinary world is very possible there, and sometimes the boundaries between the two worlds disappear. And then who can say what's possible and impossible? I think I'd rather live in the ordinary world, Garion said. The other one sounds too complicated. We don't always have that choice, Garion, the storyteller told him. Don't be too surprised if the other world someday chooses you to do something that must be done. Some great and noble thing. Me? Garion said incredulously. Stranger things have happened. Go to bed, boy. I think I'll look at the stars for a while. The stars and I are very old friends. The stars? Garion asked, looking up involuntarily. You're a very strange old man, if you don't mind my saying so. Indeed, the storyteller agreed. Quite the strangest you'll likely meet. I like you all the same, Garion said quickly, not wanting to give offense. That's a comfort, boy, the old man said. Now go to bed. Your Aunt Paul will be worried about you. Later, as he slept, Garion's dreams were troubled. The dark figure of maimed Torak loomed in the shadows, and monstrous things pursued him across twisted landscapes where the possible and impossible merged and joined as the other world reached out to claim him.